Hey friends, it's Jasmine from Jasmine's Astrology, but you can call me Jay. Welcome and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be chatting about the full moon in Aries happening on October 17th at around 7:25 a.m. Eastern at 24 degrees of Aries. And this full moon is looking like a bit of a handful. It looks a little uncomfortable, potentially inflammatory and volatile. I get the sense that it might be bringing something up and out of us, something that has been bubbling inside for a little while, something that's been grinding one of our gears, something that's sort of just been like slowly wearing away at a part of us. And this full moon brings us to this point where we just can't ignore the persistent poking any longer. It's all just got to come out. Things are boiling over and we have to express the problem. Maybe we need to assert ourselves about something lest the irritation fully consume us. This full moon has a lot of factors combining to create these bumpy and crunchy energies. Firstly, it's a full moon, and that is always a time of heightened energies. It's happening in a fire sign, which means that it's bold and there's some heat, maybe even some unpredictability. It is ruled by Mars, which adds sharp and cutting qualities and a sense of urgency. This full moon will also be squaring Mars and Pluto, which dials up the intensity and suggests that there could be some friction and clashing energies of some kind. And even though this full moon isn't technically an eclipse because the sun and moon are far enough away from the nodes at this point that it does not trigger one of the eclipses or does not trigger an eclipse. And that also means that we are out of eclipse season. Congrats, we made it. But yeah, so even though this isn't technically an eclipse, the nodes, which trigger the eclipses, are still in Aries and Libra. So the sun and the moon are still dealing with those energies as they transit these signs, and that adds a level of agitation and disruption and unsettled energies to the overall mix of things. And the North Node specifically is what we have in Aries, and that's going to bring a certain hunger and a certain desire, a certain pushing quality to this full moon. Okay, so that's a lot. There's a lot happening at the full moon. Let's back up a little bit. Let's look at all of these layers that are overlapping to create this tense atmosphere. Let's look at all of that in a little bit more detail. So, as I mentioned, a full moon always has a heightened level of energy at play. The lunar cycle up until this point has been in its building, in its accumulating phase. And so all of that is coming to a peak. There's always this very like humming and pulsating quality to a full moon as that energy just sort of builds up to a particular climax. The full moon is also happening in a fire sign, and fire energy can be intense, aggressive, dramatic, and rebellious, but it can also be really enthusiastic and passionate, motivating, and creative. Now, in this case, I think the fire energy might add more inflammation than inspiration because we are looking at a fire sign ruled by Mars, which in and of itself isn't bad, but Mars right now is in difficult condition as it travels through the sign of Cancer. And so I do see the potential for acting or reacting from a place of impatience and impulsiveness that is potentially getting stirred up by a really strong mood or emotional state that feels really like acute and overwhelming in the moment. And not like acute, it's not cute. It's like, oh my God, so urgent, so intense in the moment. But I think if we can sit for a bit and let it simmer, let it cool, the feeling might pass and it might feel less urgent, and we realize like, hey, that was probably not the right course of action. The full moon is also taking place in a cardinal sign, and then Mars moving through Cancer is also in a cardinal sign. So there's a lot of cardinal energy, which means that there's definitely something here about movement and like taking initiative. So I don't want it to come across as like taking any kind of action is fully off the table. I think we just want to proceed with a bit of caution around the ways that we are taking action, to just be sort of aware of where the impulse to move is coming from. Like, are we simply being triggered? Not simply, but is it more of like a trigger, an impulse to be defensive? Or is it, is it actually like a course of action that we think we're going to still be interested in about like 10 to 15 minutes time, or even, tomorrow? Because again, Mars moving through Cancer, it does sort of suggest that impulse to be defensive. Mars in Cancer can be quick to defend. It can be quick to attack when it feels attacked, which is sometimes absolutely warranted. Like I think about, a parent protecting their child. That's obviously like a totally warranted situation of Mars in Cancer, that defensiveness, that protective nature. But I also recognize that a lot of times defensiveness is really just a mask for something else. And that something else might actually become clearer to us under this full moon. A full moon, of course, is when the moon is at its brightest. It is fully illuminated and offering illumination. And in this instance, that realization or that moment of clarity might be around something that isn't working, something that is feeling a little bit wobbly and not going in the direction that we would like it to go. I think those trickier themes of Mars in Cancer are definitely coming into focus with this full moon, and we might get a better understanding of what our trigger points are. Because, of course, we're learning that as Mars transits through Cancer, but this full moon again brings that peak point, that moment of just like obvious in your face clarity about it. And, so we might get a much better sense about the people, the places, the projects that really cause irritation, really provoke our defense mechanisms, and that, that kind of recognition might be what compels us to take some action. And that action might be expressing or asserting ourselves, that part that I already mentioned, that thing of like something is coming up and out of us. And I will say it looks a little bit messy. Like, I don't think that our feelings are going to be coming out, that they're going to be verbalized in any kind of polished manner. Mars and the moon coming together is like that pot of water that is just boiling over. The water goes everywhere. Or maybe it's like the screeching steam that's erupting from a kettle, and the kettle that has like reached its temperature, it's ready to go. This is definitely a tip me over and pour me out kind of full moon. And even if what we're pouring out, even if what we're getting out of our systems isn't super pleasant, it's not super easy to navigate, there's definitely truth to it. It's probably all truth. There's a very direct nature to it all. There's a clarity even within that mess. The water from the kettle is still too hot to drink, to be sure, but it is better out of the kettle than still in, and causing that steam and that screech. So there's progress in that, right? Like that verbalization is a movement, is an action that we can take. Another action that we might be taking would surround some kind of ending, a separation from people, places, projects that are triggering that frustration in the first place. Mars can help us to sever and to cut cords, so we can potentially cut away from things that are only poking at our tender and soft spots, and that really don't help to create or foster safe spaces where we feel like we belong and we're protected, which is a really important factor in Mars in Cancer for that transit. And, that would also be moving with the flow of the lunar cycle, because what comes next after the full moon is certainly a point of releasing. Regardless of the action that we do take, I think it's going to feel messy. I don't think it's going to feel super easy. It might eventually lead to a really nice, really good outcome, but it doesn't look like it's going to feel super great in the moment. I think that while we're in the thick of it, it's going to feel uncomfortable, it's going to feel agitating. And I think we need to practice a lot of patience and kindness towards ourselves and others. There is this sense that, again, with Mars in Cancer, the movement, the progress that we're making is, I mean, think of the crab and the way that it moves side to side. We're not moving forward in a straight line per se. We are sort of stepping this way, sort of stepping this way. We're doing what we can to take those actions, but if things don't feel like they're fully like moving forward, like a floodgate is opening or something, and we're kind of having to move in this way, just be patient. Just embrace that type of progress for now. There's always some level of tension with a full moon because the sun and the moon are in an opposition. They are at opposite sides of the sky, they are in opposite signs of the zodiac. So there's always going to be a tension between those opposing energies, and we might feel a real push and pull type of dynamic, a need for a lot of give and take, which again would kind of flow nicely with that sideways crab movement. Now, across the Aries Libra axis, that tension can look like the needs of the self versus the needs of others. That sort of like delicate interplay between the ways that we want to honor our individuality and selfhood while also honoring the ways that we have promised to show up for other people, the, necessary compromises that we have to make to be in relationship. This full moon does suggest a time when we might be more inclined to put the individual self first. It is happening in Aries and near the North Node. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing, but we can be aware um, of that inclination towards thinking about ourselves a little bit more and try to just move with as much compassion as possible. Like asserting ourselves doesn't mean that we have to be an asshole. And all of that tension is really only underlined and emphasized by the fact that this full moon is squaring both Mars and Pluto. And so we've actually got all four of the cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. All four of them are highlighted at this full moon, making for a bit of a like prickly, fractious dynamic because those signs all make squares and oppositions with one another, which are the trickier types of aspects that we get in astrology. It's a lot of like butting heads energy. There are conflicting needs, conflicting opinions, and we might just feel like we are called or pulled in more than one direction at a time. And certain adjustments, certain sacrifices will likely need to be made in order to be able to move in any direction at all. Pluto is at the very, very, very end of its time in Capricorn. Cancer is a sign that speaks to the past. And as I already mentioned, Mars can help us to cut ties. So there is a sense at this full moon that some of these adjustments and sacrifices are about stepping away from what needs to stay in the past, like from what we are ready to put in the rear view. We might be ready to leave a particular fear behind us or a self-preservation behavior that we no longer need. Perhaps this full moon is about shedding a skin of sorts, making a clean break. Maybe it shows us what we're no longer willing to tolerate, where our tolerances have changed and where we need to step away so that we can step towards something safer, something more supportive, something where we feel more welcomed and like we belong. It does look like an opportune moment to really examine where our anger and where our frustration comes from. Why have these feelings been bubbling up? Why did we allow them to like slowly scratch and poke at us and irritate us for all of this time? And again, it's not about judging yourself. It's not a judgmental thing. Sometimes we don't have a choice. Sometimes it is about survival. Sometimes the poking is the better thing than like getting rid of the poking, if that makes sense. Like sometimes that's the only option. But this full moon does offer us a little bit of an invitation to take a closer look. How might we avoid some of this poking in the future? How might we avoid getting to like this stage of bubbling over? What can our irritations tell us about what's not working or where there are lines and boundaries being crossed, especially in the Aries and Libra houses of your chart, but also the Cancer and Capricorn houses? What might the anger and the frustration be telling us or trying to tell us about the ways that we need to assert ourselves better and more often? When we're feeling tender and raw and exposed and vulnerable, what might that tell us, or can that point us in the direction of where we don't feel safe and protected? And how can we then strengthen those areas of life or strengthen those bonds that we have with people? It could also be really helpful to increase our physical activity levels in the days leading up to this full moon and on the day of the full moon. We might need some rest after the full moon, but certainly in anticipation for it, like to get out any of that excess or pent up energy so that we don't then like direct that towards somebody else or even ourselves. Screaming into a pillow can also be incredibly cathartic, but might be especially helpful around this time to channel up any of that rage that we might be feeling. These are all really like fire, Mars, Aries types of things that can help get that out. And I keep going like this, and I'm like, oh yeah, you like boxing, something like that, that just like gets that energy out. Okay, that is all I've got for this video. I really hope it has been helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you need any clarification on any of this info. Let me know where Aries is in your chart and if you have any plans for this full moon. I would love to hear about it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. It is super helpful and it is super free. I will be back soon with more astrology insights and other cosmic chit chat. But until then, I'll catch you in the cosmos.